Good evening, everybody. My name is Paul Webley. I'm the director of SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all tonight to the second of Zamin's Cultural Forum events on global citizenship. And it's very good to see such a lively audience. I've spoken to a number of people already, so I know we're going to have an interesting session. Now, last week, the opening event focused on our notions of migration, foreignness and identity. This evening, we're going to be considering the university in a global context. Now, we've got a 2-hour slot, and the structure of the evening is as follows. First, my colleague, Chris Cramer, will introduce the theme of the evening, how it relates to the overall programme of events, and then he'll introduce the panel members. I'll say a few words and then ask each panel member to make an opening statement, and we'll sort of go down the table this way so you'll know where we are. After some reactions from the panel members and some questions from me, I'll open up the session to questions from the audience, and I will make absolutely certain that we have at least 40 minutes for questions and answers from the audience. I'm just going to briefly introduce Professor Cramer and then ask him to set the scene for this evening. Chris is Professor of Political Economy of Development at SOAS. He's worked in and on sub-Saharan Africa for more than 20 years, teaching and conducting research on rural labour markets, commodity processing and violent conflict. He's currently head of our Department of Development Studies, though he's about to step down and enjoy a sabbatical leave. He also cycled 75 miles on Saturday just for fun. So as well as being a fine scholar, he's also a very fit man. So Chris, over to you.
Thank you very much. Not that fit, just exhausted. So good evening, everybody, and welcome to what is the second event in this series of events in the Zamin Cultural Forum. Thank you for coming in such amazing weather out there. It's quite a dedication to come. But I'd also like to thank some other people involved in this evening's event, people and organizations that have made this event and the whole program possible. Our sponsors, Accenture and Barclays, and the other partners involved. So that's the Africa Progress Panel, my own university, SOAS, and the Tate, and of course the Zamin itself. But I would, before we get going, like to note in particular the contribution of two individuals to this and the related events in this series. I've been talking for, I was trying to think, it must be nearly 2 years to Michael Aminian, the creator of Zamin, about this program of events. And it's been an amazing, I think journey is the word, the cliche. It's been a huge pleasure to be involved with Michael, to be drawn into his passionate commitment to doing something very difficult, to bringing together the world of the arts, of business and economics, and that questioning edge of psychoanalysis. Very, very big challenge. And I've also seen up close the immense amount of work and patience that Michael has put into and the determination in creating this program. So we have him above all to thank. Okay. And I know it's taken a lot of other people at Zamin and elsewhere to make this true, but there is one more person I think we should mark the contribution of and thank for that, which is Marco Daniel of Tate, head of public programs here. And he's been just, fizzing with ideas, but also very firmly pragmatic in enabling this program to take shape and to take place here. So Marco, thank you very much, wherever you've gone to. There you are, thank you. Some of you will have been to the first event last Wednesday evening, and you'll know that it was a hugely successful, fascinating discussion of global citizenship, of exiles and migrants, and of identity. And today we're going to shift a little bit and talk about the production of knowledge, the circulation of ideas, and the shaping of minds that takes place or is meant to take place in that varied institution called the university. And we'll discuss this very much tonight in terms of the global context and challenges and opportunities within which universities function. And there are, though, various ways in which this evening's topic. The themes intersect those of the first event last week. Ideas travel with migrants, and they're often remitted as well. And knowledge, research, ideas are, like the movement of people, shaped and constrained by their interaction with global capital and resource flows, themes that we'll pick up on in future events within this series. And above all, just as people's movement is infringed by borders or regulated by identity cards, so too the flow of ideas and knowledge is regulated by institutional boundaries, especially perhaps when bound up with commodification and market value. Now, the other night, Saskia Sassen unsettled us all as an audience by exploring the ambiguities and the shifts in categorical identities, partly through discussing shifts in the relationships between states and citizens. And I'd like to frame tonight's discussion by recognizing that historically, over the very long term, there's always been a shifting relationship between states and universities and other groups and institutions. And that relationship has often involved a kind of tension between the idea of the university as a source of reproducing what we might nowadays call the human capital of authority, of states, and so on, or the church, long gone, and the idea of the university as a sort of thought beyond the needs of and even challenging, often challenging, power and authority. Julien Bender, of course, wrote in the early 20th century of La Trahison des Clercs, his critique of European intellectuals who were precisely not honoring what he saw as the role of challenging increasingly dictatorial political regimes then. These issues, the relationship between authorities and universities, the tension between freedom of ideas and the claims to private property rights over research and education and so on, they nowadays play out in new and profoundly globalized ways. We don't always see those here clearly enough beyond the specifics of, say, the UK fees debate, but these things are all connected, and that's why I hope tonight we'll hear about and discuss, and you'll join in, the debate around these issues. So, for example, to give you two examples, does technological change and the changes that make MOOCs, for example, possible, does that mean we're entering a new stage of the global democratization of higher education? Or is it a signal of a new phase of corporate concentration and control over knowledge and research, emanating from within the heartlands of G8 countries? Are research partnerships between, say, British and Indian researchers, funded perhaps by a UK funding agency, is that straightforwardly a way of generating an equitable, shared effort and then producing a global public good of knowledge? Or do these partnerships, relationships often or sometimes represent the reproduction and the uncomfortable relations of hierarchy and resistance? These and other things are some of the things I'm hoping and looking forward to hearing about. So I will hand over, without further ado, to our panelists, whom I would like to briefly introduce alphabetically to you. So Jo Beall sits on the executive board of the British Council, where she is also Director of Education and Society. And before that, she was a Deputy Vice-Chancellor at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. And before that, she was and for a while, Director of the Development Studies Institute at the LSE. And before that, she's got a very rich history, going back in particular to her involvement in the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. Stefan Collini is a well-known professor of intellectual history and English literature at the University of Cambridge. He's a well-known public commentator, and among other things, he's the author of What Are Universities For? Maybe we'll find out tonight. He's also written on intellectuals in Britain, and I think currently he's just back from 9 months in the States, where he's been working on a project on the history of literary criticism in the UK. So I hope he's not still too jet-lagged after coming back. And then we have Pratap Bhanu Mehta, who is president of the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi, highly prestigious think tank and research center there. He also sits on the National Security Advisory Board in India and is a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Governance Council. He's taught at Harvard, at JNU, and at the School of Law at NYU as well, and is an editorial consultant and contributor to the Indian Express. And in the past has also been closely involved with the National Knowledge Commission in India. And then we have, and I'm very pleased to have Richard Sennett, a distinguished sociologist who teaches both at NYU, where he's University Professor of Humanities, and at the LSE, where he's the Centennial Professor of Sociology, the author of many books, including The Craftsman, and Together, The Rituals, Pleasures, and Politics of Cooperation, and currently working on a project on a book on urban design. We're then very pleased to welcome the Right Honourable David Willetts, the UK Minister for Universities and Science, who's been an MP since '92, I think, and has held a number of posts, but also has written on social policy, on social and economic affairs, and not least as the author of The Pinch, how the baby boomers took their children's future and why they should give it back. An interesting comment on that in the Times when it was published in 2010 before the last election was Matthew Parris's saying that this is a book that takes the voter right above and beyond party politics. And then slightly out of alphabetical step, I'd like to introduce and hand over to the director of SOAS, my boss, that is, Paul Webley. Paul's been a director of SOAS since 2006, where he's also professor of economic psychology. He specializes in tax compliance, somewhat relevant these days, and also in the economic behavior of children. And perhaps that's about how they work out how to make their parents give them back the future that they nicked. And on that note, I'd like to hand back over to Paul, your chair for the evening.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for that, Chris. All of our speakers this evening have an interest and experience in universities and have valuable perspectives to contribute. But you might ask just at the outset why I am chairing this event. So SOAS has got a special focus on Asia and Africa as a global take on all issues. And the position and function of universities is no exception, which is why, as Chris has indicated, when we were approached to be involved in this, we were so excited by it. And during my 7 years as director, my perceptions and understanding of the role of universities, what universities are for, has been challenged by talking to our students, to our staff, by visiting universities in other countries, by technological changes and through funding issues. So I'm all too aware of things like the intensification of competition between universities, because both within the UK and internationally, because part of my day job is to ensure that my institution succeeds in this competition. I'm also familiar with the huge range of challenges facing universities across the world. I've been to Korean universities where they've had anxieties about how do they integrate international academic staff who don't speak Korean. I've visited Kurdish universities who've been worried about basic infrastructure, the teaching of English, and then how to ensure university autonomy. What do they do about political interference? And I've discussed with the Minister of Higher Education of the South Sudan how you build an entire university system from scratch. I've also witnessed some very positive trends. There have been some significant moves towards the democratisation of knowledge with the internet, the growth of open access to academic journals, and in the UK and other countries, freedom of information legislation. There's also been, Chris referred to the historical side, and I think this is important, a massive increase in the proportion of young adults that attend universities across the world. The highest participation rates are now in Korea, where 60% of young adults have a degree. This is a huge proportion and very different from a few decades ago. And in most countries now, women make up more than 50% of students. So the issues, the only reason for saying all of this is the issues that we're going to discuss this evening are not theoretical ones. They're not just kind of some interesting academic debate. These are very live issues for my colleagues, for me, for our students, for our staff. And I'm looking forward to being enlightened by the speakers and the audience. But I just would like us to bear one thing in mind. The session is called The University, but that term hides a huge variation in form, function, purpose and practice. Universities range in size from 1,000 students to, in the case of open universities, over 1 million students. So some universities are huge. They may focus on one discipline only, or they may have comprehensive coverage. They may concentrate only on undergraduates. They may focus on teaching more than research, or vice versa. They may be vocational, they may not. The students may be full-time and resident on a campus, or they may be part-time, resident in their own homes. You may have in your mind the model of an ideal or idealised university, But one thing I'd just like you to bear in mind when you're listening to our panelists is what the range of institutions are embodying the idea of a university these days. And it is hugely varied across the world of size, function, and so on. So, without more ado, I'm going to pass over to Pratap to kick us off. Over to you, Pratap.
Okay. Thanks very much. It is intimidating to be in front of an audience that has given up this lovely weather to be here. And also a lot of what I will say in the next 4 minutes or so, I learned from many of the colleagues in this panel. What I thought I'd do, since I've been asked to give the kind of opening comment, is to just sort of kick us off with kind of 4 or 5 propositions that I'll just sort of lay out as, to me, the kind of define the debate over the relationship between globalization and the idea of the university. And I'll just lay them out very sort of pointedly, hopefully as provocations. I think the first thing to remember when we talk about globalization of higher education, right, is that the current phase of globalization that we are seeing in higher education is a product of 2 fundamental imbalances in the global system. The first is a demographic imbalance. You have lots of rich countries with aging populations and lots of developing countries with large numbers of young people not finding enough opportunities for education in their home countries. And this is actually a fundamental driver of this globalization. It's not some sort of, kind of ideological thinking about what globalization might do to pedagogy or something. In this case, demography matters a lot. The second thing to remember is that education globalization at this point, and particularly I think this is true for UK, it may not be true for the US, which is an outlier in many respects, is a product of massive governance failures in the countries of the South. Right? Why do tens of thousands of Indian students go to Britain, Australia? There are 5,000 Indian students doing medicine in China at the moment, right? Studying. Why? Right? They're paying large sums of money simply because, as it were, the domestic systems are not able to respond to the kinds of demands that are being placed on them. So we have to recognize that the drivers are these 2 imbalances, and how these imbalances get resolved will shape the future of the globalization of higher education. The second proposition I want to lay out is the following. There is a debate, there is a global debate, and this debate, you can pick up the British press, you can pick up the Indian press, the Chinese press, it's roughly the same terms of debate, about the relationship between universities and the job market. Now, just to provoke you, I'd like to put out the following proposition. In the current conjuncture of globalization, there is a large structural fact that we are struggling to come to terms with, and that is the following: that wages, productivity, and employment generation do not all seem to go in the same direction. So countries have shown high productivity growth, but not enough jobs being created. Jobs being created, but at stagnant or lowered wages. Now the big debate is, what is the role of universities in, as it were, producing this structural impasse? My own view, for what it's worth, is that I think universities are being asked to bear the brunt of something that is actually a much deeper economic and sociological, as it was, structural transformation of the world economy, where we are looking, or we are assuming that if we simply got higher education right, somehow we would actually solve the structural problem of jobless growth or stagnant wages and so forth. And we really need to think hard about this proposition, because a lot of assumptions are being made about how it is that education has contributed to, as it were, our inability to solve this trilemma, if you like. The third proposition I want to lay out is that a lot of the challenges that universities are facing have got to do not so much with the logic of globalization as much as with the logic of democracy. And the logic of democracy being, in a sense, because we can't name it, we give it another name, globalization. And I have 2 particular things in mind. The first is there is a kind of inherent tension in higher education. On the one hand, we want to expand higher education, 60% gross enrollment ratios in Korea. India is aiming at a gross enrollment ratio of 30–40%. On the other hand, by its very nature, higher education is about distinction, setting yourself apart from everybody else, right? Now, as far as I know, there's only one system that very self-consciously managed to preserve this distinction. That was the German system, right? There's a vocational stream, and then there is something called higher education, the research university or something. Most democracies will not tolerate that distinction, right? Either because there's a kind of implicit hierarchy, and if there is that implicit hierarchy, that's a question society needs to answer about why it has kind of put up with this hierarchy. And so what is happening in a lot of universities, I think it's true of Britain, I think it's true of India, is that there is an attempt to convert the traditional research university into something of a hybrid model, which is part remedial school education, part vocational system, part sort of honors undergraduate degree, part high-end research universities, which is making it hard to answer the question, what is the fundamental identity of that university? Because you actually can't, in a sense, separate these different functions out. It's going to be politically hard to do. It's going to be sociologically hard to do. Right? The second proposition I would lay out, that wherever there is democracy, there will also be bureaucracy. Okay? It's an old proposition in 19th century social theory, but particularly applicable to higher education. Why? Because a democratic system will demand accountability from a system, from universities. Most historical universities are kind of elite clubs, self-generated, sort of products of, various crazy ideas, Witherspoon doing this, Presbyterians doing that, Jesuits doing something or the other. That logic simply cannot function in a modern democracy, and particularly where public funds are at stake. But once you are in the realm of accountability, essentially you're looking for something that's measurable. More importantly, something which is commensurable, where you can compare one thing to the other. Is it worth doing X more than doing Y? And even more importantly, some measure that is non-discretionary, which does not involve any measure of judgment. Because there is a suspicion in democracy that elite clubs, peer reviews, communities of judgment will build in their mechanisms of exclusion, right? Which is how universities have historically operated. But once you take on all these three characteristics, then there's only one unambiguous measure that satisfies all three criteria, and that's money. The beauty of money, it's commensurable. You can measure it without discretion. It's egalitarian in that sense, right? And I think there is a serious logic of accountability that I think is sort of constraining, shaping universities in different ways in all our democratic systems. Last and final proposition, just to lay out, is universities have what is called the 1% problem. And I think it impinges on universities in a way that's peculiar. The distinction David Graeber made between the 1% and the 99%. In the case of universities, that distinction in a different way is particularly relevant, because for the production of knowledge, let's face it, the top 1% and the top 2% matter a lot more than almost anybody else. It's true. It happens to be so, right? The challenge is that you have a giant vacuum cleaner for the top 1%, which is called the United States of America, which has essentially, the logic of the US system, the dominance of the US system, is that the negative externalities of that system is that it raises the cost for everybody else for running cheaper education systems, right? And in some ways, that structural imbalance between the dominance of the US system and the rest of the world, right, is making the degrees of the freedom that the rest of the world has to craft its own education systems immensely narrow. All of these larger sociological phenomena, I would submit to you, are the ones that are impinging and making it very hard to answer this question. What is the identity of the university? But more importantly, who should define the identity of that university? The advantage that the US system has is that it has great tolerance for lots of elite groups, all kinds of people doing all kinds of things, right? Most other democratic systems do not have that kind of tolerance where somebody simply says, look, I want to set up a crazy religious cult university, let me do it, right? So the political question we are all going to face is, who should get to define the identity of the university? Students, faculty, bureaucrats, the wider democratic demos, right? That, I think, is going to be the question that will define the nature of globalization in higher education that we experience. Thank you for that.
Jo, over to you.
Thank you. I've been asked to talk about my experience at University of Cape Town in South Africa as much as my experience of the UK education system. And I think what that dual perspective offers is insights into some of the issues around international higher education from both lenses. So if we take globalization, which is a fact, and if we recognize that it proceeds selectively, which it does, I think the common thing that I would identify both in the UK and in South Africa was a failure of most students, academics, and university managers to recognize that higher education is no exception to that rule. We did at the British Council a study of UK undergraduates in 2011 and 12, asking them about their international aspirations and how they thought about globalization. What was interesting is that most students understood what globalization was, could define it, they recognized the term. A majority were internationally aware, and indeed many had traveled. But very few made a link between that experience and their future employability or their future life. So they saw a gap year as something that you would do, but they didn't see that as important for their employability. Similarly, and for different reasons, students in South Africa saw the problems that they faced in a context like South Africa as so overwhelming. The project of nation building, of developing and maintaining a BRICS economy, so critical that it was perhaps less important to be engaged globally. Now, in both cases, that applied to the majority of students, but there are select groups in both the UK and in Cape Town who were very much aware of the importance of global connectivity, international awareness, intercultural fluency. In the UK, it's the pre-92 universities who held that view, students in the arts and social sciences rather than the sciences, and most particularly students of modern language, which is perhaps not surprising. In South Africa, the students who were interested in global citizenship and international opportunities were also amongst a more elite group, were amongst the international students there, the majority of whom were from the rest of Africa, and less so those students coming from disadvantaged backgrounds. And so if you just look at the issue through the lens of students, both in this country and abroad, I think the fact that globalization proceeds selectively is something that we have to recognize both at the broader level and at the level of the individual. So what I'm going to do is just go through three areas where I'll lay out why I think an international perspective in higher education is critical, and then come back to the experience of University of Cape Town and say something about where this leaves a university in Africa. So what we know is that demographics mean that areas of high supply of higher education have more limited demand, whereas areas of low supply, and China would be an obvious example here, have historically had less supply of higher education. So that basic demographic reality means internationalization has grown. I think the second broad issue is that the financial crisis from 2008 onwards has led to greater competition for international students amongst traditional mature markets, and at the same time economic growth moving east has meant that there's much more competition for those same students from higher education institutions in emerging economies. And I think the third broad political economy aspect is that most governments, and I'm sure David will say something about the imperatives for the UK, most governments are looking at higher education as a critical part of their development and economic planning, their economic strategies for the future. And what that means for many emerging countries is that there is a competition for the most talented students and researchers. So Singapore, for example, is investing as a government huge amounts of money attracting the best researchers to up the ante in terms of their offer as a higher education and research hub. So what does that mean? If we take the three areas of university activity, being teaching and learning, research, and public engagement, what does that context mean? Around students, the competition for international students, what we do know is that the absolute number of students who are internationally mobile has risen very dramatically in the 10 years up to 2009. But we also recognize now that that is slowing off. Perhaps the most interesting factor is that the proportion of students enrolled in tertiary education who are internationally mobile has not changed. It is around 2%. So although the absolute numbers have gone up, the proportion remains the same. That has huge implications for the competition to attract international students, for the importance of transnational education, which is partnerships between universities in the UK or US and emerging markets, which is where most of the transnational education experiences are. And it reinforces the idea that globalization is a selective process. So it's anxieties that students are going to flood in to countries abroad are unfounded. Why should we care about whether students are internationally mobile? Why should we care about them having an international experience? Research that we did with employers in the UK demonstrated that employers want the soft skills, including language skills, international awareness, intercultural competence, and want it badly. It was considered to be more important amongst the sample that we interviewed than the university that a student went to or the class of degree they got. We weren't sure if this was just a UK phenomenon, and so we repeated the study across 10 countries, looking at employers in government, not-for-profit, and private sector across 10 countries. And it was confirmed, particularly for not-for-profit and private sector, that international experience and savoir-faire was critical. So it's for that reason that some of the best universities in the most mature systems have had outward student mobility as part of what they have promoted. I'm sure David will talk about his initiatives in the UK to promote outward student mobility, something that's very much looked forward to, given that we have about 1 to 3% of our students going abroad, compared to an aspirational target of 20% for the Bologna countries. But I think it's not just for these efficiency reasons or employability reasons that we should be concerned about students having an international experience. It's also about those intercultural skills and the whole notion of global citizenship that that this series is about. We confronted at University of Cape Town very similar demands and challenges, where we had a semester study abroad program that brought in students from the better off countries, very few options for low-income South African students to go abroad. So a lot of work was around raising funds and working with the diaspora, the South African diaspora, to facilitate those opportunities, but also to create an internationalization at home program. And I'll come back to that. Something that would enable students who couldn't move for whatever reasons to work and to have that exposure. Have I got time for a little bit more?
I'm aware of time, so...
Okay. So the other thing to say, to briefly mention, is transnational education. This is where universities from different countries come together, UK universities offering a UK qualification and a university abroad. There are many models from the distance education of the Open University to branch campuses such as Nottingham. I just want to say a couple of things from the perspective of the host country. First of all, many of the transnational education initiatives are about students and about programs, and often to meet the demands of employers. And I think that's very important. And many host countries use private or transnational education, providers of education, to meet labour market demands. However, the divorcing of education, transnational education, from the research imperative of universities is perhaps a problem. And that's something we can come back to. Transnational education started off as sometimes as an initiative on the part of host countries to make up for deficits, to play catch-up. But other countries are much more defensive, and sometimes very rightly so, about poor providers, about being swamped, about it distorting the education arena. And in South Africa, at the University of Cape Town, we had many experiences where universities would come in, they would do a program with us. It would be then a case of them poaching our staff, setting up a private campus of their own down the road. So I think it's those sorts of things that we really need to think about, how the host countries engage with those issues. I think India has been doing a lot of thinking about that recently. And the last thing to say is a brief word on research. The challenge for universities in Africa and more broadly is that often they're in a position where they are expected to provide the labour force of tomorrow. The challenge is to combine that imperative with being part of a research, a global research community, and getting that balance right. And I think that was the balance we tried to strike at University of Cape Town, and I think successfully, but it's an ongoing battle not to feel that it's necessary to just produce the workforce and not to produce the research and innovation.
Thank you, Jo. Richard, over to you.
Thank you. I want to talk a little about what is good research and what works to promote it and to destroy it. And I thought I might start by just sharing with you an experience that I've been having the last 25 years in China with the Chinese Academy of Sciences. When the Chinese began in late 80s, early 90s, to put serious money into research, they had what I would call a shopkeeper model of what they were going to do, which is to say they were going to have very tightly defined research with clear outcomes, testable hypotheses, no waste in the programs, clear methodology, and so on. And they put a lot of money in the social sciences and in technology into this kind of work. Really tight, real value for money kind of research. And the results were dismal. Dismal, boring, predictable. And after about 4 or 5 years of this, people began saying, these results are dismal, predictable, and more important, there is nothing to patent. So there began to be a real period of self-questioning about what it is that produces good quality research, which moreover you can patent. And the result of that, and I take some credit for the label, is what could be called the MIT model, which is where I used to teach, as opposed to the shopkeeper model. And the MIT model is MIT's recognition that they have to spend a lot of money and that only some of this money will produce results. That you can't predict in advance what somebody will find, that negative results are important, that if somebody abandons an experiment in the middle of it, saying this is not worth pursuing, that that's productive if they do something else. That this is the way in which you produce new knowledge. You do it through, we commonly say, through trial and error. That means you do it through waste, and even more important, the recognition of failure. Now, if you were painters, you know instantly what the MIT model is about. You begin working on a canvas, it looks dreadful, you scrape the whole thing off, and you start again. That's part of the creative process. That same thing is true in science, good science, even good social science, of which there isn't too much, but that's another story. But good science works the way good art does, which is that it enables trial and error. And to do so, it takes seriously the idea of risk, which is that something may turn out not to be worth doing. And the reason MIT has done this is not because we were all a bunch of artists in the laboratory, but because, in fact, this procedure, which has been followed since the days of a very enlightened president, Jerome Wiesner, has produced tons of patents. The school has made itself rich by doing something that looks on the surface of it not very sensible. And by the shopkeeper model, the MIT model is not sensible, except it works. Now, I guess the argument I want to make to you, I've watched this process unfold over the last 25 years, is that the Chinese who have embraced this MIT model, all to the good, we in the West, except for places like Stanford, MIT, and some really quite less prestigious but equally innovative places, are going back the other direction. We're going back to the shopkeeper model. Governments are forcing this on us. Of course, there's no money, so if there's no money, how can you waste the little that you have? Isn't it better to get a certain result, even if that result is poor quality? At least you've got something. You can say, I carried out the experiment, and it wasn't worth doing, but I finished it. You know? The shopkeeper model also has much more deeper and I think structurally insidious forms of it. For instance, Professor Mehta mentioned the issue of accountability. Accountability is the shopkeeper's ghost in the machine. Because accountability means accountable to whom? If you're Steve Jobs, or even more, Jonathan Ive, who is his great design innovator, you're accountable to one person. You're not accountable to a committee. And the committee that recognizes that you may produce what Jonathan Ive did in fact produce, says, not to me, mate. You know, the practical aspect of this is if you can patent it, it's yours and ours too as well. But you understand what I'm talking about. We're walking away from the idea of discretionary spending. We're walking away from the idea of personal judgment in sponsoring research. The Chinese now, apart from the huge corruption that's in their academic system, the people who are not corrupt, and there are many who aren't, are saying, yes, in the end, what good science is about is a judgment that this is a good scientist, so give him his head. Whereas here, we're saying, it can't be that. We need objective criteria. Right? I'd like to just say one final, well, actually, I want to make two comments about this. You all know William Empson's famous bon mot that the arts are unfair. Okay? And what I'm describing is a situation which is unfair. It involves waste, it involves personal judgment, it, on the part of the researcher, and involves risks that can turn out to be very self-destructive, and so on. But the final thing I'd like to say to you about this is do not equate what I'm saying with the issue of hierarchy. I just speak very personally about this. If you look in the American Ivy League universities, which I know much better than I know Britain, the variation in the quality of research is immense. For instance, I've said this in print, so I'll say it to you. The Harvard Sociology Department, which is one of the most well-endowed sociology departments in the world, produces really mediocre work. Whereas next door to it, Tufts University, whom nobody has heard of, produces fantastic research with no money. But they have followed the MIT model. And they've hired lots of young people who they've given a free hand rather than put on a regime of RAEs, or what do you call them now here? REFs, publishable articles. Tufts got to be a great place to do research because it said, take 5 years if it takes you that long. Do whatever it takes to make it work well rather than make it work. So I think this issue, what I want to leave you with, is that the issue of quality research is not an issue of elitism. And we've got to think that through in order to support places like Tufts or whatever its British equivalent is, that are not part of this elite structure, but may contain wonderful researchers in it, or have a research ethos that is, in the end, going to produce good quality research, and even, David, lots of British patents.
Thank you, Richard. The Minister was taking notes, so I think we're okay. Stefan.
Well, when I was asked to come and talk at this panel, I assumed that there would be a lot of people here, people on the panel and in the audience, who know a great deal about universities around the world and who know a lot about the nuts and bolts of financing and governance and so on. And so I thought I would try and talk about something that's likely not to be mentioned, talk about something that might even be a little provocative or unpopular. So what I've now done is put myself in the paradoxical position that I've come prepared to talk about creativity and originality, and by doing that I'm going to be absolutely mimicking what Richard Sennett has just said. You don't need us both on the same panel, I think, is the motto for the future. The reason I was thinking along these lines is that obviously there has been a huge expansion of higher education around the world and will continue to be in the immediate coming decades in terms of numbers of students and numbers of institutions. And lots of the institutions that are set up or are now expanded do a range of, as we all know, very worthwhile, often very practical things, which may be related to kinds of vocational training, may be related to stimulus to the local economy, may be related to preparing the next generation of school teachers and so on, which in certain social or cultural circumstances are absolutely essential things to do. But the question I wanted to raise, and this is, as you'll see, just really another version of the question that Richard has just been talking about, is what do we think are the conditions that can conduce to high quality intellectual activity? I think it's not, if you have enough political will and a moderate amount of resources, it is not that difficult to produce a middle-level technical institute. You can train a lot of people to do a lot of useful things. It's much more difficult, and seems in a way almost an elusive goal, to aim to set up or convert one of your existing institutions into an absolutely high-level hub of open-ended, top-quality inquiry. And really, I think the question I want to put is just why that is and what things we might think about apart from the financial and governance aspects. And I'm just going to mention two very obvious ones. And as I say, all I'm going to do is just repeat what Richard said and put these in other words. But I think the first of these is something to do with the ethos and morale that you have among your academic staff. And that has got to be, fundamentally, something to do with a kind of autonomy. What Richard was talking about just now with the MIT model is, in part, an example of this, the willingness to let people have their head, as it were. But I think it can also be generalized a bit further to say that it's something about encouraging a shared commitment to that scholarly enterprise, independent of its practical benefits. And unless you can, in some ways, support this among your academic faculty, you are forever, as it were, going to be turning out very good lab technicians, but not very good original creative scientists, and the same for other fields of inquiry. And I think this is where something that's been touched on by several speakers already now comes in. There is this inevitable tension between the conditions for creativity and the conditions for democratic accountability. And we're all familiar with this in our own lives now, and it's already been touched upon. The thing that has been mentioned so far is the need to recognize that at some point, judgment will have to play a part, which mere measurement, quantitative measurement can't altogether do. And I certainly support that. But I think the other aspect of it, as I say, is that you are going to, at some point, to have to be willing, and this is a difficult thing to do if you're in any responsible position in an institution, and more difficult still, I think, if you are responsible to an electorate as some kind of elected politician or official. The thing you're going to have to do is try to explain to those whom you are accountable to that the best way to make the academics in your top-level institution serve their purpose best is to leave them alone a good deal. And that is a very unnatural thing to do. It's absolutely essential that we provide constant reports on what they're doing and that we measure it against what other people are doing and so on. And some of those things are indeed necessary. But the difficult task, I think, is to find ways, especially if you're establishing new institutions, is to find ways to conduce to having that ethos where a professional commitment to the shared project, rather than any form of alienated labor, which is doing it out of some kind of compulsion or fear of surveillance, is what animates your academic staff. And that's not an easy thing to create. The other, also rather elusive condition, I think, that helps here, and this is one that is a good deal rarer than the first, is it helps no end to have some form of public discourse which is effective in your society, which can give voice to the long-term purposes of universities. That's to say, we're all very familiar, any daily paper will provide us with new examples, we're all very familiar with the language of contribution to economic growth. Indeed, an important aim. But we're not at all familiar with other ways of talking about the long-term intellectual, cultural, scientific, social, and eventually economic benefits that open-ended inquiry brings to their host societies if it is conducted at a sufficiently high level. And this is again, whereas you can hear, I'm in a way just restating something that Richard said, that is that you've got to find some vocabulary for generalizing some of the apparently wasteful or unattractive aspects of what he was calling the MIT model. I think you've got to find a language about creativity and a language about autonomy that will have some purchase in public debate when confronted with a very hard-edged language about short-term economic benefits. And again, that is not easy to do, but if you do not develop some attempt at languages of that kind, I think what, in whatever society you are where you're setting up new institutions, what you will end up with, I think, are again those relatively limited, intellectually sometimes somewhat mediocre, quite useful institutions, which are among the institutions we need, but not what, if we want to have good universities, we mainly need. I think this also does have, in a different and perhaps rather unexpected way, a so-called global dimension, in that one of the things that we should think about for the next couple of decades is how far there's a kind of cultural dependence being reenacted in this expansion of higher education, because the intellectual agenda for so many disciplines is being set by a very small number of very well-supported first world institutions. And all the while that it's difficult to develop any rival institutions, all the while that the other countries are committed to what I'm calling the short-term or practical conception of these institutions, they will find, I think, that they are in the medium and long term very much in the cultural and intellectual shadow of those big intellectual powerhouses. It is, I think, in other words, something that is urgent for a range of what have often up till now been called developing countries. All these vocabularies, as you know as well as I, are not very satisfactory. But for a range of such countries, it is not just a matter of prestige or amour propre. It is a matter of whether they can develop the right kind of intellectual inquiry at the right kind of level and not simply import it. So my concluding thought is that it's very difficult to sit up here and hold forth about the aspects of intellectual inquiry which are the most elusive, which can seem to be, in some cases, rather snobbish, which, as again Richard said, often are assumed to be related to an elite hierarchy of institutions, and nonetheless to want to say, as I do want to say to you, that I think those are absolutely fundamental questions about what universities do, and that for any society in the world, these are not something which can simply be bypassed in pursuit of some short-term economic goal. If that society wants to have good universities, then I think these are among the things it's going to have to develop. Thank you.
David, you're in the position of sweeper now, so...
Well, thank you, Paul, and thank you for the opportunity to join this discussion. I think what I'd better do is let me respond to the Sennett Collini critique and then touch on move on then to the globalization issue. Take Richard's examples, I thought were very illuminating. He began with examples from the American Ivy League, Stanford, MIT. Largely privately financed and with substantial endowments, and insofar as they receive public money related to projects and programs. So this free inquiry, and I completely support the model, isn't that the US Department of Education is writing a check for the philosophy department at Stanford. When they write a check for Stanford, it's to do this project in electrical engineering. But Stanford separately has endowments that enable them to function in the way that Richard describes as well, which is completely admirable. And we are fortunate, we have got some universities, notably but not only Oxbridge, that are kind of in that situation. And I share Richard and Stefan's admiration for it and love of it. The Tufts example is where it gets trickier. And Richard, being scrupulously honest about these things, then cites Tufts. So what would we do if we wanted to support somehow those social scientists at Tufts? I think the thought process might go as follows. Well, first of all, we should keep politicians out of it. And what we need to do is have a group of social scientists themselves who will assess by their own peer-reviewed standards the quality of the social science emerging from a range of universities so that we can spot talent and high-quality work in a place like Tufts. So you'd invite your leading social scientists to sit on a panel where they would identify Tufts. You would then say it's very important that we don't specify to any social scientists what actual work they should do. So when these social scientists have identified the work, we will then give the money to that university with no strings attached for it to spend on whatever projects it wishes. And that is currently how approximately £2 billion a year goes to our university. It is absolutely an attempt through public policy to do something like supporting that social science at Tufts. If anyone has any better model of how you could allocate public money, not the Ivy League sit on a big endowment, allocate public money in some model where Richard can say confidently, I know they do very good social science at Tufts and it should be supported. The question is, what is the way you would use public money to do it? And I think the model of a group of leading social scientists doing peer review and not incidentally supposed to be looking at the prestige of the journal in which this work appeared would be quite a good model. In fact, it has largely been developed by the academic profession. The extra tweak is you might, after 10 or 20 years of this, say, because we've been focusing so much on the quality of their academic output, we're slightly worried that all they're focusing on is getting those articles out that meet the highest academic standards. So we need to get their heads off the academic treadmill of the excellent articles and invite them, not all of them, let's think of a low percentage, say 10% of the evidence they work, to be also something where in whatever however broadly they define it, their work has made an impact on the outside world. It could be a play has been produced drawing on an interpretation of this author from the literary critic or scholar in our department. It could be, as a result of this insight in social science, a public policy has shifted somewhere in a developing country. Invite them to look out beyond the production of their excellent peer-reviewed articles. And that is essentially the model we have. In other words, it isn't, it may be imperfect, though I have to say, nobody has defined one that's much better that involves the use of public money. That's why the Ivy League is a bit of a red herring, really. But that is where this model comes from. In other words, it is not an assault on the values that Richard and Stefan are advocating. It is an attempt through British public policy, and the spending of really quite a substantial amount of public spending, incidentally not been reduced, even in this age of austerity. We've actually even managed to maintain it. We've even managed to maintain it. It's an attempt to try to deliver the Tufts challenge. Now, that, however, as Stefan said, is part of higher education. It's not the full story of higher education. And if you're sitting in India, you probably think our institutes, our IITs, Advanced Institutes for Technology, are a bit of a disappointment, really. They were funded on that type of way. We're going to have great, smart Indian thinkers doing first-rate science research in India without any of these constraints, and you visit them and they feel like Oxbridge or Stanford, and they've had beautiful sites carved out from them in leading Indian cities, and they're pleasant environments, and they basically have not flourished in the way that India hoped that they would. There are people who know far more about India than me, but that, from my experience of visiting them, is their frustration. So it's not easy to do, and I go all around the world, and if I added up the different numbers of opposite numbers I've met in different governments who told me that their government's commitment is to get 5 universities into the world's top 100, it probably adds up to 1,000 by now after all the visits I paid. So it's harder to do in practice, and we're very fortunate. It is partly path dependent. We're very fortunate in a small number of countries like Britain and the US, we've got some of those types of institutions. We also incidentally try to sustain the freedom of inquiry by the other thing you might try to do, if you're trying to preserve this Richard Stefan model, which we should try to do, is you might also say, why don't we give money to our leading learned societies for them to hand over, no strings attached, to people that they think are brilliant researchers without any requirements on output whatsoever. So we also do that, and also incidentally not reduced either in the age of austerity. So the British Academy, the Royal Society do that with public money that we provide to them, where we have absolutely no view on who it should go to or what they're doing. We just tell them, here is money for you to grant to people who you think are potentially great scientists. Meanwhile, so that carries on, and that is something we're very fortunate to have in this country, and America has some of it. Meanwhile, there's a subject which we're also trying to talk about today. Meanwhile, the Indian education minister says to me he wants 40 million more university students in India. The Indonesian education minister says to me that he wants 250,000 more university students in Indonesia year after year, growing each year by a further 250,000. So my next question to Richard and Stefan is, right, you can do a kind of Oakeshottian prose poem about these beautiful, great institutions where freedom and intellectual inquiry flourishes, and I love it myself. I've even written one or two in my time, though never as good as Stefan's. But is that totally relevant when the Indonesian minister comes calling, says, right, I want another 250,000 a year, how is Britain going to help? And the answer is, it doesn't actually massively help them in their challenge. And although Stefan, I thought, just slightly dismissively said, of course, you also have people who produce technicians or teacher training or things like that. If you're sitting in India or Indonesia, these are completely legitimate ambitions to have. These are also legitimate and valuable roles of higher education institutions. Is there any responsibility that anybody thinks, sitting in an Oxford or Cambridge common room, they have to help the world meet those challenges? 50 years ago, we produced the Robbins Report, which was about the challenge of expansion in Britain. The world now faces, globally, the equivalent of the Robbins moment, a desperate hunger for the massive expansion of higher education in a range of crucial countries that are going through a kind of demographic sweet spot with a surge in the number of young people, where they're becoming middle income, where they're enlightened governments that want to see their young people better educated than ever before. And they're looking at what, if anything, the West can offer. And I have to say, on that, Stanford, MIT, Oxford, Cambridge, LSE, brilliant. But on that, to be absolutely honest, the West has pretty much not offered much at all. Because offering something to help in those type of requests that I get involves rather different models. Because what you've heard from Richard and Stefan is the kind of trusteeship model of the university. We have this incredibly precious intellectual environment and we want to pass it on to the next generation. And that, as I say, I completely respect. I have no desire to change that. We are not forcing anyone to do anything differently. But there is separately a kind of enterprise model, which is if you really did want to say, I'm going to try to deliver higher education to another 500,000 people in developing countries in the next 5 years, what would you try to do? But you'd probably concluded that you need professional management, and you need some kind of access to private capital, and you need some kind of standardized operational model so that you could roll out higher education. Not of the sort that Richard and Stefan love, and not a threat to that, but you would say the only way we can provide India with the teachers or Indonesia with the engineers is some type of model like that. And other countries do it. America has several organizations do it. India, incidentally, does as well. The Amity Foundation, Manital, mass delivery of higher education. And what Britain has not done, because we are transfixed with this alternative model, completely admirable, I always have to say this, I'm not against it at all, we have completely failed to rise to that challenge. So what the closest we've got is saying to China, desperate for mass higher education, well, we might set up 2 campuses and after 5 or 10 years, they might have about 2,000 students each. That's kind of ambitious internationalization in the world of English higher education, but it doesn't really rise to the challenge. If we wanted to rise to the challenge, we would have to look at alternative models. We both have to look at alternative ways of organising higher education, not forcing this change on any existing English higher education institute that didn't want to do it. We'd have to think, how would we organise ourselves if we were serious about mass delivery of higher education in Indonesia, or Colombia, or Mexico, or Turkey? What would we actually do? And you have to organise and engage in these type of challenges. And slightly to my disappointment, no single English university has tried really to do that. Probably it's going to be happening by some version of MOOCs, and this is my final point to touch on. It's probably going to be some version of MOOCs. And we are asked some questions about MOOCs, and it's early days. I think that they can deliver a high-quality education experience, probably the use of education analytics, which I suspect isn't going to be used in the institutions that Richard and Stefan were rightly praising. But if you do want to know how someone is learning the maths they need at higher education level, probably knowing every single stroke they do on the keyboard as they work through a set of maths problems and exactly what point they go wrong and whether 50% of people go wrong in the same way or the different ways they go wrong, and what you do to help put them right, is probably in the long run quite an important advance in pedagogy and educational technology, and I think it's going to be harnessed. It'll probably not be purely online, there'll probably be interaction with others. It may involve concentration in a single platform, which I would regret. But there are certainly people on the west coast of America who think that's what's going to happen. And after we've had Amazon and we've had eBay and we've had Google, they think that there's going to be a single HE platform which around the world is used to access online courses, and that they think they're winning that race because Britain was very slow to recognize what was happening. You may find that there is a significant British platform, probably FutureLearn, sponsored by the Open University. You may find there's no single platform that wins out. And my very final point, it may paradoxically also offer some support to those more established and conventional universities that we have in England, because one way in which existing universities will use this is as a recruitment device. And what the experts tell me is one of the things that happens when the internet arrives within a new service industry, and essentially higher education is now on the receiving end of the arrival of the online experience, is one of the crucial things that happen is disintermediation. So universities that have hitherto relied on agents in other countries to help them find their students, sometimes with not completely defensible and straightforward arrangements either, will find they have this new set of potential recruits who are doing a university course online. But even that will face them with a challenge which will be very uncomfortable. Imagine that you are a leading British university with well, let's say you've got a social sciences department like Tufts, and imagine that you have 50,000 international students who want to start doing social sciences, who are doing social sciences on your online course. And incidentally, these online courses, they often start with things like electrical engineering and artificial intelligence. The good news with humanities is there's enormous hunger to do things like philosophy, history of art. It's not all STEM subjects. But so you've got 50,000 people doing social sciences. Now, there's a very high dropout rate. Very few people will complete a course in the conventional MOOC now. Maybe 5,000 will complete the course. And out of those 5,000 who complete the course, imagine there are 10% of them who you think they are at least as good, if not better, than my own first-year social science students at my own studying physically at my university. You've still got 500 students that you've identified around the world who are now potential recruits for your university, and that could well be larger than your current social sciences undergraduate numbers. So even then you will face a challenge. Do we expand? Do we welcome more overseas students? What do we do? And it will be very interesting to see the interaction of English universities. But that agenda is, I think, the global agenda, and there is one practical thing that we could do in the next months which helped progress it. And that would be that the Millennium Development Goals currently only describe education in terms of schooling. They have nothing about tertiary education or further education in them. The history of Britain would be very different if we had not had any universities until we had achieved 100% literacy. And that is the model that in the past 20 or 30 years the development establishment has imposed on a range of countries, including notably sub-Saharan Africa, where there is sometimes I meet fellow ministers with deep resentment at the focus on literacy and numeracy, completely admirable objectives, but to the exclusion of the support of any higher education institutions in their countries. The World Bank was part of this consensus as well and is now reversing. Imagine a Millennium Development Goal about access to tertiary education. I think that would be a great way in which we could conclude this debate this evening. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, David. I'm going to give Richard and Stefan, because you bracketed them, and just to give the opportunity to comment, to see if they have anything in response to what you said first.
I have many comments.
Well, some salient.
I guess the first thing I would say, David, is that your problem is not you. That is, it's not the model. Your model is, and you personally, are something quite different from what I think the bureaucracy that you oversee operates as. Am I putting this delicately? I hope I am. Okay. Now, in that regard, I'd like to, and I think that's a serious problem for you, because most academics would, listening to what you've just said, would say, if only. So that's a bureaucratic problem, and I think it's something that you either can or will be able to address or not. But it's the practice rather than the policy that I think is the issue in the shopkeeper model. In that regard, I'd like to say something about, we shouldn't be talking about Tufts, about its American equivalent, which is Goldsmiths College, which I think is a remarkable institution. It mostly trains people at night. Most of the people it trains are not born in Britain. It has intellectual standards which, at least in my area, are much better than the LSE's. And I asked its principal, my friend Ben Pimlott, a long time ago, how did this happen? And he said, well, nobody was noticing. So that's what I mean, that your problem is not you. It's actually that they were so unimportant that they were below the radar screen. So anyhow, that's a set of issues I don't think we can really discuss, but it's my comment to you about this. I want to say something on online teaching and MOOCs, because I've done a lot of this. MIT was early on committed to this. And like many technological aspects of mass education, it's not what it's cracked up to be. And I'll give you a very simple example of this. I did one of the first online courses at MIT about the development of urban form. It's kind of a historical course, theoretical course. Lots of pictures. It looked beautiful when I saw it on the screen like this. It looked absolutely fantastic. And if I may say, I did a pretty good job in these opening lectures. You know what the problem was? My email address was online, and after the first lecture, I got 7,000 emails. Now, that's great, but you see the structural problem already. I had 4 teaching assistants whose emails weren't online. That was the real. But even if I'd had 40, imagine dividing up 7,000 emails each week among 40 people. And what happens with MOOCs and online teaching, I think it's the experience that the Open University has had, is that you really, because unless you're just teaching facts, you know, if there's no interpretation, no thinking, just memorizing facts, which you can do online to 1 million people, you know. Unless you're doing that, you have to follow the principle of the Open University, which is the course is open to as many people as can be accommodated in some face-to-face responsive situation. And for the kinds of problems that you're talking about, how to add 250,000 new students, it's back to square one, which is that you have to have, let's say, 2,500 teaching assistants. And those 2,500 teaching assistants would have to be able to communicate with me. You see what the problem is about this. So it looks like a cheap solution, and believe me, they look beautiful, these courses. They are fantastic. And in some way, they are very instructive, except they're not teaching. That's the problem with them. So I think that's the issue we face. This is not a technological fix for the kinds of problems you're talking about. So those would be my 2 responses. One which I know you can't answer, and the other which I think is a real issue, you know, about, and as I said, I was very enthusiastic about this. I love high tech. I use it all the time until I made this error of publishing my email address. So that's how I answer.
Well, I think you all know now pretty much how the tunes go in these discussions. This is not the first time that David Willetts and I have talked about these things in public, and it has a certain familiar style to it, I have to say.
We'll move on quickly then.
Well, no, it doesn't turn out to be as quick as you might like, actually. I mean, I'm sure I ought to regard it by now as extremely flattering to be cast as a more or less unworldly Cardinal Newman who is rather out of touch with the world. But I do want to just say one thing first. I'll get on to the more substantive issue quickly, but one thing first in self-defense, since I have to say this each time we have this discussion, which is that I didn't mean, and I don't mean, and I don't think I am, at all dismissive about the various more limited and practical objectives which I said different types of higher education institutions carry out. Those are absolutely essential. As I think I said, and I tried to say very explicitly, depending on your cultural and social situation, they may be your priority. My question was about if you want to go beyond that and are interested in the question of what it is to develop really high quality university work, what sorts of things should we be thinking about? That doesn't demean the other things, it just means that other things to be thought about. Now, on the question of the types of progression or institution, the one additional thing I would say, because actually on a lot of these matters, most of us up here don't hugely disagree. Let me just give one other kind of example, go back to a different sort of American example, the California model, much cited, recently, of course, in some trouble because of voter recalcitrance about tax and so on, although even that may have changed in the last 2 years. But the key point here, I think I would bring out of this, is that it was a deliberate attempt to construct a system, not just a few good universities, but to have local community colleges which did something which the British system has on the whole been rather bad at, which is the second and third chance education, to provide mobility between types of institution. These could be gateways and ladders to going somewhere else. To have then a whole tier of state universities which often combine much more ambitious intellectual programs with a great deal of immediate local and practical relevance, and then to have the University of California at the top, as it were, in those terms. And within that system, they certainly managed to produce many good institutions of each of those three kinds, and of course, two of the most famous world universities, perhaps in the case of UC Berkeley and UCLA. Now that seems to me something that we should think about, because we should think about a system of higher education. And it seems to me that the merit of that example, which was mainly initiated by the Chancellor of the university system there, Clark Kerr, was an attempt at some overall planning of this. And the parts of the world that David mentioned as being at the moment very much engaged by what they should do in the future seem to me might well learn more from a public conception of a system like that than from a variety of, as it were, market-led private initiatives. The only other thing that I would say, and again I'm going to remain I forget where I'm put, on a pedestal or in the clouds or in some...
You're on a pedestal.
Pedestal,
You're
right.
definitely
Okay,
on a pedestal.
right, in the clouds or somewhere very elevated anyway, but actually very easy to push over. It's the great virtue of pedestals. Is just to say that one of the things that recent writing about universities around the world remarks, and it's not so confined to any one national system, is a sense of malaise in universities, that for all this expansion, and people here could give you impressive figures for increased expenditure on higher education, for all this expansion, a feeling that something is not going right, a feeling that there is something here that is making universities, both university teaching as a career, but possibly, in some cases, university education as an option for students, future students, something making it less attractive rather than more attractive. And I think unless we can try and probe that very widespread feeling of malaise, our confident assertions that we've got the right systems and what we need to do is, as it were, generalize them, are not going to produce really the results that we hope they would. So on that score, I think we should be more cautious. Lots of other things we could say, we've said them before, so I'll stop there.
Just one sort of, I enjoyed everything you said and agree with the challenges you outlined, particularly of scale. But I think there's a real danger. And the danger I see is the following, which is that developing countries, I think the place where we went wrong was in misunderstanding what is it that gives the American or the British system its resilience. To my mind, the core aspect of that resilience is a diversity of institutional forms. The trouble is, once you get into the games of scale and number, the immediate impulse of government is to actually eradicate all that. What killed Indian higher education effectively in the Indian university system And it actually, I mean, like Britain in the 50s and 60s, there were several great public universities doing great work at low cost, which effectively were sidelined, was when they actually got into this idea. So, I mean, in a sense, the MIT model needs to be extended to institutional forms as well, as it were. That you will have to play around with different kinds of institutional. When our education ministers come here, unfortunately, what they don't get is that message. What they get is the message is, there is a model out here, it's going to scale up to 250,000 students without teachers and so forth. So that's just a small plea.
Yes, David, briefly.
Let me just respond. I mean, first, I very much agree with the final point. And the number of times when you visit an education minister around the world, and what they want is, now how can I would like to link our universities up to Oxford and Cambridge, please. And I'd like to send more of our students to Oxford and Cambridge, please. And I do try to explain that we have 100 universities with diverse missions, and that actually the University of Bournemouth is an excellent institution. And if you want, I think the only university that is in the top 10 for diversity of entrant, in other words, takes people from a wider range of social and ethnic backgrounds, and in the top 10 for employment outcomes afterwards. I think the only British university that's in both of those leagues within Britain is the University of Huddersfield. But they won't. So there is a sort of incredibly powerful prestige model where you're pushing against sort of a very strong value system. And so I think it's a fascinating point. Let me just touch very briefly on the three other quick comments. First of all, on California and Clark Kerr. And Clark Kerr was in a way America's Robbins for a state, not the entire federal system, but writing at the same time and with a similar atmosphere. But remember how the Californian state system works. It is run by a board of regents. And the board of regents enforce the specific roles on the component institutions within the Californian system. And in other words, they are not none of the universities within the Californian state system have the autonomy that English universities enjoy. If you are part of that system, and your job is the vocational side, or you're the feeder institutions, or you're the people who do doctorates, those roles are set for you by a supervisory body that is more powerful than the individual university.
Except for two, which were the two most flourishing institutions, which were Berkeley and UCLA. Well, and this top-down management broke down with them. They wouldn't have it.
All I can say is I've had this conversation with the president of the University of Berkeley in the last 9 months, and he spent half the meeting complaining about what the regents were trying to do when he was trying to write it. And his argument was, as we get more of our funding from fees and less from the state has to grow up and recognize that its ability to give me instructions in the old way in the Clark Kerr model is breaking down. So I repeat my assertion. They are not autonomous institutions, and what we have done in England, because of our history, is the mantle of Oxford and Cambridge autonomy. Those fellows of Magdalen College in 1686, or whenever it was, rejecting the imposition of a president chosen by James II, that tradition now belongs to every university in England. They each enjoy greater autonomy than in the Californian system. And second point about the Californian system, the other way it works, because it's state-financed and ultimately state-run, is they can say something like, we'd like the top 10% of kids from each one of our Californian schools to go to university. And that, in some ways, is an admirable step towards social mobility. I said, well, we couldn't get away with that in Britain. It would be denounced as socialism and social engineering. And I remember a Republican in California saying to me, but there are smart kids in central Los Angeles, and of course they don't get good grades because they haven't been very well taught. But if you have the top 10% from each school, so that the smart kids from every school go to university. Now, the fact they can run that tells you also something very important, which is the academics do not determine admissions. The heads of department and the academic faculties are not determining who goes to those universities. If you have a policy like saying the top 10% of school kids from each school goes to our universities, you are again running an admission system with far less autonomy than our universities expect. So my view is that Stefan wouldn't allow me to get away with Richard's model. Actually, this wouldn't stand up the Californian system. Now then, the final point, emails, final point. Richard and his 7,000 emails. Now, I'm in danger of sounding like a Californian technophile, but if you have sat, as I did, in the lecture theatre at the LSE to hear Sol Khan of the Khan Academy describing what the Khan Academy has done in the past 2 years, you would realize that this is soluble. He had that. He started putting on Facebook his little videos for his extended family, and he immediately found he encountered this problem. And what they've done, what you do at Coursera, what you do at edX, what you do at the Khan Academy, what Future Learn is going to have to do, is you create a learning community in which the students, half the question, many more, the students compare notes with each other and share how they solve these answers. You have some moderation. But what you've managed to deliver at the Khan Academy, I think he said, you've now got 50 million students signed up. Not necessarily, of course, all going to complete. A tiny fraction will complete a conventional course. He got 50 million students with a staff of 35. So that's quite a good ratio if you want to spread access to higher education. So if and you do it by pooling the fact that even your students, your learners, have also got something that they can share with your other learners. So I personally think that's why I think this is a more significant change in education than Richard does. I actually do think that the arrival of the social media and the internet in HE is a big change.
Thank you. I failed miserably in my role as chair. I hope you don't mind, since I, for one, have enjoyed greatly what the panel has said. It wasn't my intention, but it was great, so that's fine. The MIT model, thank you. We've got half the amount of time that I said we would have for questions. They're roving microphones. We'll take blocks of questions. Can I ask people to make sure their questions are short? Just ask one question, don't make a statement. That'll give the panel an opportunity again, if we can answer those briefly, to give as many people as possible an opportunity to say something. So starting right at the back first, and then we'll just move on down.
Thank you. I'd like to...
yeah, could you say you are as well?
my name is Natalie Jeremijenko. I teach at Goldsmiths and at NYU.
Oh, excellent, right.
Yes, okay. I'd like to bring up the issue of technical education, which I think has been grossly underserved by the current models of MOOC, and demonstrated a promising model by the Khan Academy. And this is a model of essential mobility, where in fact becoming a sociologist or literary theorist is not the aspiration or the channel for mobility that most students, are attracted to university through. Yeah. What it is an engineering degree, a computer science degree, a medical degree, some kind of professional degree that is actually not headed towards the kind of research methodology. And this is where the transformation of the professional and technical education is perhaps less challenged, because the model of the MOOC has promulgated the worst form of STEM education, right? In every single problem set driven analysis standardized test has been celebrated as, and we know from 30 years of looking carefully at the attrition rate of women and minorities in the science and technology and engineering math fields, that doesn't work, right? So I'm getting to my question. So
quickly, please.
The question is, how do we seize the opportunity of MOOCs to change professional education and technical education so that it is not, it seizes the material experimentation, changes what is professional research, changes the capacity of who gets to do distributed, on-the-ground experimentation, not in the lab, but in action research, and how we reimagine and redesign our urban systems through that.
We're going to take 5 questions. Can the rest of you keep your questions? Forget about the preamble, just the question. Right over there.
Thank you.
One sentence.
That's
or 2 at most, but short.
My name is Gunnar Beck. I shan't give my institutional affiliation lest it cause some embarrassment.
Yes, thank you.
But I'd like to come back to one of the first points raised, that was the German education or higher education system. It's during its heyday, it was undoubtedly one of the most successful. It was very unbureaucratic, but interestingly, it was also largely publicly funded, and yet not to any large measure or undue measure government controlled. In fact, it bestowed very considerable autonomy on its academics. So my question is, what makes it impossible now for a publicly funded higher education system to work in this way? And does that not highlight some pervasive problems with our society at large? And perhaps one final sentence, if I may. I mean, generally, I think conservatives have a very good grasp of what makes a good university, but maybe they're forced to act too much like New Labour now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are you going to be brief? If you're going to be brief, otherwise I'm not letting you have the microphone. But
one sentence.
One sentence. Come on, try just one sentence. Come on.
Subject can't be dealt with in one sentence. My name is Rod MacDonald. I'm a civil engineer, so I'm steeped in science and technology and all the rest of it. I've spent a lot of time traveling around the world in the last few years. And what concerns me when I see this country, and I'll talk about this country, is that we are absolutely steeped in colonialism. We still believe we are better than everyone else in the world. We've been hearing about our education system and how everyone should be copying what we're doing and all the rest of it. What are our universities going to do about changing that attitude? And the second thing is that the most important thing that I see missing is open-mindedness. So technology, I'm completely steeped in, but open-mindedness, being able to see outside the box and be able to do things differently. And what are our universities going to do about that? Because it's not around at the moment.
Thank you, Rod. Okay, who would like to try one or more of those? Jo, off you go. Pick one of those, have a go.
I think I'd like to pick up on the last one because it echoes very much with my experience of both being on the other end of, on the receiving end of visits by one Vice-Chancellor or Deputy Vice-Chancellor International after another, all of whom would come to University of Cape Town and say, what can we offer you? And very few asked, what can how can we benefit from some kind of mutuality? And if I just take the MOOCs example, I was there before MOOCs, but I was there at the time of open source and open access. And we had a partnership with the University of Michigan where we developed an online course together in infectious diseases. Now, Michigan got a much better product on infectious disease by working with the medical school at University of Cape Town than they could have done alone. So there are examples of where mutuality can be of benefit. Putting out all those issues that I did earlier on competition, I'm of the view that we've, in the UK, have got 5 to 10 years of being able to hold our position as a preeminent supplier and provider of higher education and research. I think we have to be very cautious of ignoring what's going on elsewhere. In China, whereas the rest of the countries which have higher education and research collaborations, between 2000 and 2010, that's doubled. It's 5 times greater in China. So I think the competition is great. I think a lot of what Richard and Stefan have been talking about is exactly what makes our education system precious and which will enable us to maintain a strong position in the world. But that if we ignore the differentiated systems that are growing up, particularly in emerging power countries, it'll be at our own peril.
David, what makes it impossible for us to have a publicly funded HE system?
It's not impossible. We have a significant amount of public funding in the provision of the loans, and of course writing off the loans for people whose incomes don't go above 21,000. Maintenance grant, which is more generous than in Germany. One of the reasons why they have residential universities, and we have people who move around the country to go to university. We have covering the costs of high-cost subjects through the Band A and B disciplines. So yes, we do have public funding. We have a public-private mix, just as the benefits of universities are also both public and private.
Mook, do you want to comment on the first question?
Yeah, well, this is a subject that really interests me, technical education. I wrote badly about it in my book, The Craftsman. And, the old model is the workshop. And the alternative model to that is, learning surgery or a surgical procedure by watching a screen is equally impossible. And what we need in technical education, it's really no different, technical education, than I think learning any kind of craft, poetic craft, whatever, is how we can have some of the conditions of hands-on learning without having a world of small workshops anymore. That's why, and this is something I think is really important for you, why getting paid apprenticeships for people in businesses, absolutely crucial. The Germans do it, and we're starting to do it. And this, to me, is the only way that that we can do this. We have to get what's called in the States vocational education back into the vocations. And I think it's the most important thing this government or any government at this moment could do. There's a real skills gap in this country at the level, and I'll keep you here all night if you let me talk about this, but there's a real skills gap at that borderland between skilled working class, lower middle class, manual labor. And it's not because, the Poles work for less money that they're getting those jobs. We have a fantastic problem. And since we don't have polytechnics, we have to solve it in the workplace rather than in school. That's my own view.
Okay. Right, next set of questions. Craig at the back.
Craig Calvin from the LSE.
Wait till you get the mic, Craig.
I want to.
Here's a difficult question. It's my ball.
Yeah, that's why I thought I'd ask him.
For you. But I'd begin by saying I thought Pratap's comment was really important at the beginning, that there is no single model of the university, and we're destined to a fairly incoherent conversation as long as we keep talking about the university and ignoring all the many kinds of differentiation and the muddles we get into when we try to bundle all these different missions indistinctly into single institutions. And in that regard, I think part of it is, when does higher education need to be coupled with research and when not? What can be scaled up effectively, what not? All of these sorts of things. And back then to the Sennett Collini line, which sounds like some sort of part of learning about World War I. I want to ask Richard then, I'm going to say Richard's wrong about one thing in a speech that I thought was overwhelmingly very interesting, very good, and see if it matters that I think he's wrong. And that's the Harvard-Tufts comparison, where I both disagree about the sociology departments, and which is interesting, but that's not the important part. It's that Tufts is richer than any UK university other than Oxford and Cambridge, that it costs more than any UK university to go there as a student, that money is used to support whatever blue skies research and open-ended inquiry is being conducted in Tufts sociology, none of which is supported by government money, and unless you count tax exemption as support. So does that matter to this model? Does who pays matter, and the extent to which Tufts is radically unpublic, whether or not we agree about how good the work being done there is?
Okay, thank you. If you pass the microphone over, then that will save a bit of time. No, straight.
Julius Weinberg, Vice-Chancellor at Kingston, one of those terrible universities that produces people who go out and create jobs. This is a university which houses both the Centre for Modern European Philosophy and the largest workshops of any university in London for designers, fashion people, those that are creating the economy of modern London. I just wonder why much of the panel seems to be in a rather bizarre, elitist discussion. And I must say, it does remind me of the ghost of J.H. Newman.
Thank you. That's one down here. Yes. Yeah. Oh.
Hi, can I, one sentence one?
If it's genuinely a sentence.
Yeah, unusually I'm going to break the rule because I'm a journalist. I'm going to do it in one sentence. Anne McElvoy from The Economist. David Willetts, if you had absolute freedom, no fear of a reprisal or being called a socialist, would you go the top 3% route in terms of allocating prize places in universities per school and alienate possibly the entire middle class parentage of Great Britain?
Right, that was a nice brief question, but in pink? Yeah. Thank you.
My question is, how can we make changes in our institution to move towards an MIT model in the face of undemocratic university management, government policy, and broader global neoliberal trends? I'm a student at SOAS and the SOAS Students' Union's campaigns officer, and I would love.
Thank you for that.
I would love to explain.
I'm glad
I would love to explain the negative effects of privatisation and David Willetts' policies in detail at SOAS to you. Obviously, there's not enough time, but yeah, how can we reverse those changes?
Right. Would you like to reply to your boss's question first, Richard, or not? Oh. He said the question was, does who pays matter? That's my understanding. Tufts actually is a very rich university.
It is.
Yeah. So. Yeah.
I don't think so, but that's because I don't know much about money. I'm sure it makes a huge amount of difference to you because you have to deal with these problems. I mean, my end of this is just to say that I think the important thing is to think well, not to think like a shopkeeper. And the bureaucracy is stacked towards that kind of shopkeeper accountancy. Sure, it probably helps to have money, but I give you the example of so many, and you know this as well as I do, of so many really good universities and colleges in the U.S. In which people are just scraping by and doing really good work. But I'm probably very idealistic about this. But I just think if you start with the notion of what you want to achieve, that then the means begin to fall into place differently than they are falling into place now.
Okay.
That's my only response.
David, if you had absolute freedom, top 3%?
Well, first of all, it's on the 3%, on Anne's 3%. No, we are in a completely different system. I have no desire to control admissions to universities. I have the whole UCAS, universities choosing who they admit model, is a key part of the English system. We are an outlier, but that's our history, and I support it and celebrate it. The American system depends on far less autonomy than we have in our system. And this leads to the bureaucracy question, the question from SOAS, because I do sometimes think in these debates that I have strayed as the minister into a series of essentially internal cultural issues within universities, of which there are about 3. One is, certainly in Oxford and Cambridge, a lot of it is colleges versus university. And I may say it's also a bit of an issue in London. So you have the endless sense that colleges have to fight back against the university, which leads into the second one, which is the arts and humanities versus the physical sciences, where there is a sense of vulnerability on the side of humanities, which is then transmitted as seeing the government is attacking us when we don't sit around trying to plot the demise of the humanities, we rather like them. And then there is, thirdly, where everything is now so bureaucratic. And there is virtually no bureaucracy at my disposal whatsoever, and I would not wish to have one. The bureaucracy, the bureaucratic debate, and I hear it from my friends in the universities, is almost entirely about the internal organisation of universities. As what has happened is institutions, which used to be people sitting in libraries and operating from relatively small labs with modest budgets, have suddenly become organisations with total budgets of £250 million, £500 million, £750 million. And suddenly, sets of organisational challenges and responsibilities follow from that. And the process of adaptation to this growth in the size and scale of the university and its budget also creates cultural tensions in universities. None of those issues are essentially government matters, though I realise part of our responsibility is to be the people on whom these anxieties are transmitted.
Stefan. I think we're going to give you the last word, Stefan, because it's getting on.
Very short words and 3 short points. One is just that it seems to me a pity if any talk about quality, if any attempt to think about the conditions of quality, has to be in some way stigmatized as elitist. I think quite a few of us have made an effort to try and say this is a serious issue, which isn't just a matter of some kind of traditional hierarchies or some other kind of intellectual snobbery, and it can concern any type of institution, and I think that is true. Who pays, does it matter? Just to add one small point to that, not the practical point, but it sometimes, I think, makes a difference to the population's sense of, as it were, ownership of the institutions and of how far they cater to that population rather than how far they cater to a small, by and large, well-heeled select slice of that population. I think that's not a simple question, as we all know here, but I think that affects the public perception of universities in that way. And the third one, just about governance, I think there is another aspect here, which is where academics have been culpable, which is that by withdrawing from many of the internal administrative functions of universities, it has led to the necessity of a professional cadre of administrators who sometimes have other conceptions and maybe other interests. And although academics have partly done this in response to pressures of things like research assessment and so on, it's been a career model move, I think, and it seems to me to have been a very bad one. I think academics, just as we should take at least as seriously the responsibilities of teaching as research, even though the pressures are the other way, we also should take seriously, no doubt this is part of the view from my pedestal, but we should also take seriously the obligation to run our institutions and to take our own turn in doing this. And if so, I think some of the things I suspect you're pointing to, which I would certainly recognise, would not now be in place in a lot of British universities.
Thank you. That's very good timing. That's 9 o'clock. I was supposed to be timed 5 minutes to do a summing up. The idea that I could sum up what the panellists have said or what the audience said seemed to me utterly absurd. But I, for one, at least, will take away a few points, one of which is about the importance of diversity and diversity across the board. Another one that a number of speakers have mentioned is autonomy and the importance of university autonomy in all sorts of different ways. I was particularly taken by Pratap's point about the logic of democracy and bureaucracy and what that does to universities in a wider sense, and the importance that we think in terms of university systems and not in terms of our single universities. Can I just conclude the evening by thanking all of those who made this possible. First of all, the panel members, and you, the audience. Without them and without you, we wouldn't have had an evening. We should also thank Michael Ominian and Zamin. Without his vision and drive, none of this events would have happened, and this evening, that's very good. And also the 5 sponsors Chris mentioned at the outset. They're all up there on the board: Accenture, Africa Progress Panel, Barclays, SOAS, of course, and Tate Modern. We're very grateful to everyone for making this possible. And finally, there are always in these events large numbers of people who work behind the scenes and who don't get thanked, but they know who they are. So my thanks to all of those who work behind the scenes. So we're pleased to be part of this, and I'm sure some members of the panel will still be around if you want to ask them questions afterwards. There may be others who are rushing off, but anyway, thank you very much indeed.